And Joyce will be able to see the screen, right, on his presentation. Good. Can you hear us, Joyce?
Yep, I can.
All right, great. Well, just an intro, Mickey will be giving his talk on do elephants have names? And then that's Joyce Poole, who's the voice of God in the background there, who will, there'll be a little bit of dialogue and maybe some conversation afterwards. So just want to set everybody up. Go for it. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. So for those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm Mickey. I'm a postdoc at Colorado State University, and I work with George Whittemire on elephants. So one of the fundamental components of human language is vocal labeling, which I'm defining as using a learned sound to refer to an object or individual. And the reason I say learned is because learning is one of the things that gives our vocal labeling as humans such flexibility, because we're not limited to communicating about a set series of topics that can be innately programmed. So this type of vocal labeling, where you learn a sound and use it to refer to an object or individual, is extremely rare in the animal kingdom as far as we know. There are very few animals that have been demonstrated to do something like that. One exception, of course, is bottlenose dolphins, which, as Diana talked about yesterday, can imitate the unique signature whistle of another dolphin in order to address them, which is effectively calling one another by name. But one important difference between naming via imitation of the target and the type of vocal labeling that's common in human language is that naming via imitation inherently limits communication to things that make a sound that can be imitated. And an important feature of human words is that they're arbitrary in structure, meaning that they're not derived from the sounds made by the thing that they refer to, nor from any other properties of that sound. In other words, they're not iconic, they're arbitrary. And of course, dolphins can learn arbitrary labels for artificial objects in captivity, but we don't know if they use this capability in the wild. So while signature whistles themselves are arbitrary in their structure, in that they're not iconically connected to the identity of the dolphin who makes the signature whistle, when they're used in the context of addressing another individual, I would argue that they're not arbitrary labels, because they're labeling the referent, the labeling the receiver, by imitating the sounds that are typically made by that receiver. So if we could find an example of learned arbitrary names in a non-human species, this could have really important implications for our understanding of the evolution of language, because it would provide us with another case to compare with humans and try to understand the selection pressures that may have led to the evolution of this rare ability in our own species. And it would also potentially blur the line somewhat between what we think is unique to human language versus what's found in other animal communication systems. So that brings me to my study species, the African elephant. So elephants are interesting from the perspective of studying vocal communication and potentially naming for a variety of reasons. So one, they're often out of sight of their family members when communicating, so it could be particularly valuable for them to be able to address one another by name. More importantly, unlike other mammals, elephants in captivity are known to be capable of learning to imitate and produce novel sounds. And this is something that is found in a few other mammal species, dolphins being one of them, humans being another, but it's definitely the exception rather than the rule among mammals. And the most common type of call that elephants produce is something called a rumble, which is really, I always like to use the analogy. I think talking about rumbles as a single call type is a little bit like if an alien came down to planet Earth and was interested in studying human communication, and they're like, okay, we're gonna catalog the human vocal repertoire. We've got screaming, crying, laughing, grunting, and this other call called speech. And that seems to be the most common one that they make. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that rumbles are speech, but they're analogous in the sense that rumbles are the vast majority of calls made by elephants, and they're structurally highly variable and produced in almost every behavioral context. So I think that most of the interesting communication in elephants, at least from my perspective, is happening in these rumbles. And rumbles are partially infrasonic. So the fundamental frequency, at least of adult elephants, is typically in the infrasonic range. The higher harmonics are typically audible to us. I'm not sure if this will play, but let's see if. There we go. So that's a typical rumble sound. So one type of rumble that they make is this contact rumble, which is a call that's produced over long distances to communicate with family members who are out of sight. And then another type of rumble that they produce is a greeting rumble, which happens when two individuals who've been separated for some period of time come back into contact. And Joyce further splits greeting rumbles into two types. So she categorizes them as either greeting rumbles or little greeting rumbles based on how exuberant the display is, how long they've been separated, that kind of thing. For the purposes of my study, I just lumped them together. But these are basically just defined as calls produced when elephants are engaged in an affiliative interaction after some period of separation. So we set out to answer the following questions in this study. So one, do elephant calls contain acoustic variation that's specific to individual receivers? So that's kind of the first step in determining if elephants have names. Do these calls even have information that is specific to individual receivers? Number two, if these calls do have information that's potentially a name, do different callers use the same name for a given receiver, or does every caller use their own name for a given receiver? Three, are these names, if they exist, imitations of the receiver's calls in the way that bottlenose dolphins' names are imitations of the receiver's signature whistle, or are they arbitrary? They're unrelated to the sounds made by the receiver. And finally, do elephants preferentially respond to their own name? This would sort of be the gold standard to show that not only do the calls have information that identifies the receiver, but the receivers actually pick up on that information and understand it. So I collected data in Samburu National Reserve in northern Kenya, and also collaborated with Joyce to use her data set that she collected in Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya. And we identified individual elephants by their ear shape. So in both the Samburu and the Amboseli populations, these elephants have been studied continuously for decades. And we know all the individuals in these parks by the unique shape of their ears and tusks, et cetera. And so I recorded the identity of the caller, the identity of the receiver, and the behavioral context of each call when possible. And I identified the receiver using behavioral cues. So for example, if we had a contact calling situation where everybody in the family is moving together and there's one individual lagging behind, then somebody stops and turns toward the individual who's lagging behind, makes a long distance call, we can reasonably infer that the individual she was calling to is the one who is lagging behind because everybody else was with her. Or similarly, if there's a greeting call between two elephants and I know who made the call, then presumably the receiver is the other one engaged in that greeting interaction. So I decided to only include contact and greeting calls in this analysis because they're the two contexts where I think it's most likely that naming might be occurring. And they were also the two most common contexts for which I was able to identify a single receiver. So in total, we ended up with 625 contact and greeting rumbles from Samburu and Amboseli. So again, objective one is to determine if the elephant calls have acoustic features in them that are specific to individual receivers. So to do this, first I had to extract some features from the calls. And we went back and forth on a lot of different possible ways to do this, but the approach we ended up settling on is sort of a multi-step approach. So we take the spectrogram of the call, which is on the left, and that's just a representation of frequency on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and then the heat map represents the intensity or the amplitude. And then past that call through a MEL filter bank, which is a psychoacoustic filter bank that's meant to approximate the hearing sensitivity of humans, but it turns out it works pretty well for other mammals too. So basically humans and other mammals, including elephants, we're better at hearing the differences between low frequencies than hearing the differences between high frequencies. So this filter bank increases with width as you go up in frequency. So it's kind of blurring higher frequencies together while providing greater discrimination between lower frequencies. And then after passing the call through the MEL filter bank, you get a MEL spectrogram, which is this sort of blurred spectrogram that's warped to the acoustic perception of humans and to a lesser extent elephants. And then, so this MEL spectrogram has 26 bands in it, 26 frequency bands. And for each band, I took as the first raw feature just the vector of energies in that band. Then I calculated from that vector of energies the delta coefficients, which are the differences between successive energy values, and then the delta coefficients, which is the differences between successive delta values. So essentially what this is measuring is the contour of energy in a particular frequency, in particular MEL frequency band, the rate of change of that energy over time, and then the acceleration of that energy over time. And then I also measured the Hilbert amplitude envelope of each call. So in total, ended up with 79 raw acoustic contours for each call. But each of these matrices of 79 contours is going to be a different size for every call because the calls differ in duration. So in order to turn them into features that could be used in a statistical model, I stacked all the calls end to end, ran a robust principal component analysis on it, which basically decomposes the data into a low rank matrix. That's decomposes it into a low rank matrix and a sparse matrix. The sparse matrix essentially represents outliers, and the low rank matrix represents the principal components of the data that are not outliers. And you set your threshold for outliers with a parameter called lambda. And then took these robust principal components, calculated the means of the first 74, which were the number required to explain 99.9% of the variation. We also calculated 16 different measures of the modes of modulation in the principal components themselves. And I can go into that in more detail if you'd like, but suffice it to say, it's just describing how the principal components change over time, essentially. And then also four summary statistics from the sparse matrix as well, just in case the outliers mattered. So we essentially took the calls and through this step of multi-step process, turned them into a series of features that could be put into a statistical model. They're a little bit uninterpretable, but we chose these features because we thought that they would describe the relevant variation in the calls. And then I took these features and put them into a random forest model. So I imagine that most of you don't need any introduction to random forest, but for those who do, essentially it's a collection of decision trees where every decision tree in the forest uses a different subset of the data, and it's splitting the data at each branching point into and so it splits it more and more until it arrives at some finishing point, which is where like all calls that are in the same terminal leaf are sort of categorized together in the same category. And then you have this averaging procedure across all the trees to come up with a single classification for each observation in the data set. So I used 500 decision trees, 6 acoustic features per node in the tree, and then 60% of all the observations in the data set per tree. Yeah.
Tried using this on human speech to see what happens.
I have not, no. What would be the idea behind doing that?
Just to see what sorts of features you have picked out if you only sort of have the answers in the back.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I didn't do that, but that's definitely worth thinking about. Okay, so we have this random forest architecture, and then the idea is that we want to train on part of the data and test on the remaining part. So I use 6-fold cross-validation. So essentially the data set split into 6 equal-sized components, and we train on 5 of those components, test on the 6th, and then do that for all 6 folds so that the data is trained and tested on the full data set, but not all at once. And then average the results across the folds. So so this random forest will give us a classification accuracy. It will tell us what % of these calls were classified. Oh, I guess I forgot to mention the most important part, which is that the random forest is trying to classify the identity of the receiver of a call as a function of the acoustic features. Sorry about that. That was a key piece of information. So essentially, this random forest is going to tell us for what percentage of these calls can be correctly classified according to who the call was addressed to. So if the calls have some information in them that's specific to individual receivers, you should be able to predict the receiver from the acoustic structure of the call. But in order to determine if that percentage that the random forest predicts correctly is better than random guessing, we have to have some null model for what you would expect under random chance. And there are a few different ways to do this. The way that we chose is to run the same model with the acoustic features randomized. So it's essentially getting input data, but the input data is meaningless. And then we did that 10,000 times and calculated the classification accuracy each time, and then generated a distribution of these classification accuracies with randomized features. And then we compared the original classification accuracy from the model with the real features to this distribution of classification accuracies produced using random features. And so this gray histogram is the null distribution, and this red line is the classification accuracy we got with the original model. So the original model correctly predicted about 20.3% of the calls, which is significantly greater than what we got with the null distribution. I don't have the data here, but I also tried using a majority classifier where you just always predict the most common receiver, and it also performs significantly better than that. So this suggests that these calls are specific to individual receivers, but there's still some alternative explanations. So one big problem is that in our data set, caller ID and receiver ID were correlated. So certain callers were far more likely to call to certain receivers and vice versa. So it's possible that the model could just be using caller specific features, that is like features that are associated with the voice of the caller, and using those to predict the identity of the receiver, because caller and receiver are partially aliased in its data set. Also, another possibility is that rather than being specific to individuals, the calls are specific to broad categories of relationships. And again, because of this aliasing of caller and receiver ID, if the calls are, say, specific to like mom rather than a particular individual, and most of the moms in the data set happen to be a few individuals, then it might guess those individuals better than chance. So to rule out these two alternative possibilities, I did a couple things. First, we categorized the relationship between each caller-receiver pair using these 11 categories, which we based on our knowledge of elephant social relationships. This may not necessarily be how elephants categorize their relationships, but it is at least based on their biology to a degree. So things like a mother calling to her daughter, daughter calling to her mother, individuals of roughly the same age calling to each other, and somebody calling to an older female who was most likely her allo mother when she was young, that kind of thing. So we've categorized the relationships between every possible pair of callers and receivers in the data set. And then we calculated a random forest proximity score between each possible pair of calls in the data set. So the proximity score is essentially a measure of similarity between any two calls in terms of the acoustic features that were used by the model to predict receiver ID. And the way this is calculated is if you look at all the decision trees in the random forest, we take so for any two calls, so let's say call A and call D, where in this data set, each letter represents an individual call in this figure. So let's say we take call A and call D, and we look at across all the trees, what percentage of trees in which both call A and call D were included, did those two calls appear in the same terminal node of the decision tree. In this example here, we've got 4 trees, and A and D appear in the same node, the same terminal node in 3 of them. So the proximity score would be 0.75. And we used a more recent formulation of random forest proximity scores that account for the difference in size between nodes. So it's just basically discounts this in terms of the probability of a call ending up in a particular node in the first place. So again, the important thing is that this is just a measure of similarity between any two calls. And then we ran an ANOVA to look at the mean proximity score as a function of the particular type of pair that we're looking at. So each pair of calls could be categorized. We only looked at the pairs of calls where they were produced by the same caller. Both calls were produced by the same caller. So these calls could either be categorized as both callers in a given pair were addressing the same, both calls in a given pair were from the same caller addressing the same receiver, or both calls in a given pair were from the same caller but addressing two different receivers who had the same type of relationship to that caller. So here we're explicitly controlling for caller ID and for the type of relationship between the caller and the receiver. And we found that pairs of calls with the same caller and the same individual receiver had significantly higher proximity scores than pairs of calls that had the same caller addressing two different receivers with the same type of relationship to them. So this suggests that the calls are not specific just to different categories of relationship, but they're specific to individual receivers, and also that the model was not just using caller ID to predict receiver ID, because even when you hold caller ID constant, you're still get calls from the same caller to the same receiver are still more similar than calls from the same caller to different receivers. So for objective 2, whether different callers use the same name to address a given receiver, we had two predictions. Number one, a random forest trained with calls from one set of callers should be able to predict receiver ID in calls made by a different set of callers. Yeah.
I think I got a little lost somewhere in the first objective. So is it right to say that you did some feature extraction in a fairly unsupervised way, random forest, all of that, but okay, you got some features out, and then you wanted to explore whether these features were relevant to the hypotheses that you were posing. So once you have your features, you can test proximity between calls in the feature space.
Yeah.
And then you, in objective number 1, you checked whether the relationship type was significant in this.
That was only part of it. So objective number 1 was to determine if the calls contain information that's specific to an individual receiver.
Okay.
So we showed that we showed that you can predict the receiver better than chance from the acoustic structure of the call. But in order to rule out the possibility that the model was actually using caller-specific features rather than receiver-specific features, we held caller ID constant with the proximity score analysis. And then we also controlled for the relationship type. So that way we know that the calls are specific to individual receivers, not just to broad categories of receivers. And also that it's not just that the model is using the correlation between caller ID and receiver ID to predict receiver ID. Even when you hold caller ID constant, the calls are still specific to individual receivers. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So number 1, if different callers use the same name for the same receiver, then a random forest trained with one set of callers should be able to predict receivers in a different set of callers if the receivers are the same across the sets of callers. And then 2, calls with different callers addressing the same receiver should be more similar than calls with different callers addressing different receivers. So we found mixed support for this idea. So in a random forest, we trained a random forest using training and test splits such that all calls from a given caller receiver pair were always in the same fold. So the model was never tested on the same callers that it was trained on. And when we did this, it performed no better than a random model. So essentially we found no evidence that the model could predict receiver ID when it was trained on a different set of callers than it was tested on. But when we looked at the proximity scores, calls, I don't know why this thing is, it's been popping up like, it's weird because I can't see, I don't see it on my screen. I only see it on the, it's so annoying. I don't know how to make it go away.
Close.
Oh, there's the cursor, gotcha.
How many computer scientists are in the room?
All right, so All right. I don't know why it's not showing on my screen now, but anyway, basically so the random forest was not able to predict receiver ID across callers, but calls from different callers to the same receiver were significantly more similar in their proximity scores than calls from different callers to different receivers. So to me, this suggests that most likely there is some convergence among callers when addressing the same receiver, but they're not converging completely. Or there's just additional variation in those calls that we're not able to parse out because we don't know what variation in the calls is important for encoding receiver ID and what variation is used to encode other information. So, okay, I think I may need some technical assistance to get back to the presentation because it's not showing the slides when I click over.
While he's doing that, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Did you get a proximity score for the same, like the call against its identical self? I'm just trying to figure out the effect size. I get this.
No, I don't think you can calculate a proximity score for the call against itself because the proximity score is, yeah, thank you. It's calculated as in terms of how often they appeared in the same terminal node together.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good question.
Just trying to understand the y-axis.
Yeah, so so these, we're only looking here at pairs of calls that had different callers, and either they had different callers addressing the same receiver or they had different callers addressing different receivers. And so the two calls in a given pair are always two different calls. And in this analysis, they always had different callers. Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you explain the graph on the left again?
Sure. So the graph on the left, the gray histogram represents the distribution of classification accuracies with random acoustic features.
Okay.
And the red line represents the classification accuracy with the real acoustic features. So it's basically smack in the middle of that distribution. So it was not any better than a random null model. So objective 3, are these calls imitations of the receiver's calls, or are they arbitrary? Are they unrelated to the sounds made by the receiver? So in order to do that, we assessed if the calls were quote unquote imitations of the receiver's calls by classifying each call as either convergent or divergent relative to the receiver's calls. So convergent calls were more similar to the receiver's calls than typical for that caller. Bless you. Again, using proximity scores as a measure of similarity, and divergent calls were less similar to the receiver's calls than typical for that caller, using proximity scores as a measure of similarity. So if elephant calls are imitations of the receiver's calls, then we would expect that the random forest would only be able to correctly predict receiver ID for the convergent calls, but not for the divergent calls. But that's not what we found at all. We found when we looked at the results of the random forest for just the convergent call, like just looked at the predictions of the random forest among just the convergent calls versus just the divergent calls, in both cases, it was significantly better than the null expectation. So this suggests that it doesn't really matter if the calls are convergent on the receiver's calls or divergent from the receiver's calls relative to what's typical for that caller. The random forest is still correctly predicting receiver ID from the acoustic structure of the call. And finally, the last objective was to determine if these putative names in the calls are actually meaningful to the elephants. So to do that, I did a playback experiment where I played back 2 contact calls each to 17 subjects. So each subject received 2 different playbacks on different days. One playback was a contact call that was originally addressed to the subject herself, and the other was a contact call from the same caller that was originally addressed to somebody else. So the idea is that if receivers react more strongly to their own name, they should react more strongly, more quickly, call more in response to calls that were originally addressed to them relative to calls from the same caller that were not originally addressed to them. So we're controlling for call type by only using contact calls. We're controlling for the identity of the caller by using test and control calls from the same caller. So the only difference here is who the call was originally addressed to. And we predicted that they would react more quickly and call more in response to calls that were originally addressed to them. And that's exactly what we found. So we found that subjects approached the speaker significantly more quickly in response to playback of calls that were originally addressed to them compared to playback of calls that were originally addressed to someone else. We also found that they vocalized more quickly in response to calls that were originally addressed to them. And finally, we found that they produced more calls on average after playback of calls that were originally addressed to them. Yeah.
Why such a long latency?
So I think elephants are just kind of slow in general. They take their sweet time about things, and they don't necessarily react on the same kind of immediate time frame that we do. So I measured the latency over 10 minutes. That may have been excessive, I don't know. But often we would see a reaction after several seconds.
Would you consider like some sort of biomarker, like some sort of heart rate or sort of?
I mean, heart rate would be really interesting, but I think the challenge is that to put any kind of tag on an elephant, you need to immobilize them, which is huge. Yeah, a huge operation. Eye tracking could be done, but I think it would be very hard to do in the wild because there's just so much interference from the light levels and shadows and the elephants moving around, and you can't get super close to them. So usually in playback experiments with wild animals, you use more obvious things. Like with primates, they often use where they turn their head, but with elephants, they don't have the same degree of binocular vision as a primate. So them turning, and they also don't depend on eyesight as much as we do. So turning their head isn't necessarily as big of a tell. I also measured things like vigilance. I don't show this here, but I didn't find any difference with vigilance. But again, it's a little bit hard to measure vigilance objectively because, well, like if they're raising their head, and when exactly do they put their head down? You know, they're kind of lowering it slowly. So I don't know, but the differences we found were in the latency to approach, the latency to vocalize, and then in the number of vocalizations. Was there another question? Okay, so in conclusion, we found evidence, one, that calls are specific to individual receivers and most likely not just to broad categories of receivers. We also found evidence that different callers use somewhat similar, but definitely not identical calls for the same receiver. We found evidence that receiver specificity is likely not contingent on imitation of the receiver's calls, which suggests that the names are likely arbitrary in structure. And finally, we found that receivers can determine if a call was addressed to them just from the acoustic structure of the call alone. So I think there are some interesting implications of this, which is one, as far as I know, it's the first evidence for wild animals addressing one another using essentially arbitrary labels. Two, it suggests an adaptive function for vocal learning in elephants, which until now we didn't have any empirical evidence that suggested anything about why elephants have this ability to learn new sounds in captivity. Now there's some reason to believe that perhaps they're using their vocal learning ability to learn names for one another. And this could speculatively, this could be a reason why other taxa have evolved vocal learning too. So there's a lot of animals that have vocal learning that don't use it to produce complex sexually selected song, but they all live in complex fission fusion societies where it might be advantageous to address individuals by name. And there's some evidence in parrots, for example, which are also excellent vocal learners, that they can address one another by name too. And then finally, there's some interesting cognitive implications for elephants here. So just quickly, I don't know how much time I have left, but
maybe 5 minutes and then bring to us.
okay, yeah, that sounds good. So just wanted to talk a little bit about where I'd like to take this in the future, if I can get, assuming I can get funding and everything to continue the project. So one thing I would really like to know is how these names are encoded in the rumbles. And I think the biggest limiting factor here is the imbalance in our data set where caller ID and receiver ID were correlated. So what I'd like to do is just intensively record from one family so we can get a more balanced data set with calls from all the callers addressing all the potential receivers. and then retrain a machine learning model using this balance data so that we can implicitly control for caller ID in that model, and then identify the calls that are consistently classified correctly across model iterations, and then try and ultimately synthesize names so we can isolate the particular features that encode them. And there's a few different ways you might do this. One, we might use more interpretable features and use something as simple as a nominal logistic regression to just see which features come out as significant predictors of receiver ID. Another possibility is something a bit more sophisticated, like a GAN, to try and generate names for particular individuals. I think it would also be fascinating to know if we can identify these names and isolate them, to know if elephants are using names to talk about other individuals in their absence, which would be really interesting because this would be an example of displacement, talking about something that's not currently there. And first, we obviously have to reliably identify the names in the first place. And then finally, it would be very interesting to know if elephants use vocal labeling or naming outside of the context of personal names for individuals. For example, they might use names to refer to places. So when elephants are deciding where to go as a group, often there's some vocal exchanges, and maybe Joyce can talk about this a little bit, but there's the possibility that perhaps these vocal exchanges are negotiations about where to go next. And by combining recordings of these vocal exchanges with machine learning and GPS tracking, or just following the elephants in a vehicle, we could potentially determine if they're labeling places as well as individuals. So I'd just like to thank my collaborators and funders, and I think we'll turn it over to conversation with Joyce.
I guess we probably have a lot of questions, but maybe can we beam Joyce in?
Hi.
Let's see, there you are. All right, so yeah, we'll pass it to you first, and then we'll open it up to the team.
Yeah, it's so exciting because watching elephants for all these years, and it's so clear sometimes when they're in a group and someone will give a contact call and one individual will answer and nobody else pays any attention, and then the same individual will give another contact call and a different individual answers, or in the case of greetings or little greetings, a similar sort of thing. I always felt that they were directing these calls to specific individuals. So it's just so exciting after all these years to be able to collaborate with Mickey and to come up with these exciting results.
Joyce, maybe would you mind sharing with the group some of your background of your life's work and up, just a brief overview?
Yeah. Well, I mean, both Mickey and I are really fortunate to be associated with projects, very long-term projects on individually known elephants. The project that I've been associated with is the Amboseli Elephant Research Project that was started by Cynthia Moss in 1972. And I joined in 1975. So, it's in its 51st year and has followed the lives and deaths, the lives anyway, of 3,900 elephants. There are 1,800 elephants alive today, living in 63 families. And there are now 23 elephants still alive today, who were alive at the beginning of the project, were born in 1972 or before, 4 males and 19 females. So having, and in the case of Mickey, I think it's something like 30 years, isn't it, Mickey, from that?
Yeah, I think, I don't remember the exact year. I think they started in 1997, something like that.
1990. Oh, yeah, you're right. I think it may be that. Yeah. So in fact, it's interesting because both Cynthia and Ian, well, Cynthia got her start on elephants working on Ian's, assisting Ian on his PhD work, and helped to set up the whole individual photographic recognition system that both of these projects use, and also the method for collecting the sightings records, and the monitoring in general. So you can't do this kind of work without these very, very long-term studies on individually known animals, especially with animals as long-lived as elephants. I started, I was studying male reproductive behavior, and then got very interested in the fact that the males, when they were threatening me, were making a sound that I could barely hear, and that didn't make much sense to me. And turned out that most of the rumble was infrasonic, and that put me in touch with Katie Payne, and we started working together. And Katie then began the Elephant Listening Project. So that's another very long-term study then on forest elephants. So there've been a kind of in a way, a small group of us that have spawned these very long-term projects, which are going to be so valuable when it comes to the work we have ahead, which is to use AI to try and understand these animals better.
Thank you. I'll open it up to the team. Any questions from here?
I just would like to know how much you personally can differentiate between the different calls, or is there something where you suddenly recognize or immediately recognize that individual's name is being called?
So I personally cannot differentiate between them at all in terms of identifying who they're addressing. The only way I can have any idea who they're addressing is from behavioral cues. Joyce has a lot more experience than me. I don't know. Do you have any inkling from a call of who the intended receiver is just from hearing the structure?
Well, by the type of call, by the type of rumble, then one can guess who they're referring to or who they're talking to. But if it's just the greeting rumbles and the contact calls, no. It is based on the behavior. One of the things that I really use when we were talking about who is the receiver is the response of the animal, that head lifting and the way the ears are lifted is typically the animal that's being the receiver. So, but it's pretty, in a way, it can be quite subtle.
Yeah.
Do you use names for the elephants that you make up?
Yeah, we do. So we have a numbering system in Samburu, but we no. Our goal is to interact with them as little as possible. Where basically they're habituated to humans in vehicles, but we want them to treat us as a feature of the landscape. We don't want them to be altering their behavior because of our presence.
But a lot of people work with elephants so in different capacities, and presumably
so presumably that they give them names, right? At least some
Sure,
people.
you mean in a captive setting?
Right. Are the elephants attentive to those names at all? Or
as far as I know, yes. I mean, from what I understand, I've never worked with captive elephants, but from what I understand, they're capable of learning not just their names, but quite a large vocabulary of commands. But again, these are wild elephants, not domestic elephants. So we're not trying to call them or anything. We have numbers for them and also names for them, but that's just so we can identify who they are. Yeah.
Hi, Joyce. Amazing work, and obviously, it's really an honor to speak to you. My name's Shane. I'm the sperm whale biologist on Project SETI. And so, Mickey, I have questions for you too, but I can catch you after this.
Sure.
Because they're more specific to your talk. But I was wondering, with all of these amazing computer scientists in the room, if you could sort of think about, after spending so much time in the company of animals, elephants, you know, where you think the computer scientists can come in and support sort of the questions you never thought you'd be able to answer, or the questions that you know are answerable but require a new approach. Because I think that'd be really fascinating.
You want me to answer? I mean, I think that, you know, the one that Mickey talked about, whether elephants have place names, because, you know, every day in their lives, these are families that, like ours, are splitting apart and coming back together again, making plans about where they're going to go each day. And they use what I call a let's go rumble, where they use the axis of their body to point the direction they want to go. They use a lot of intention movements along and give this very particular rumble that's very distinctive, and look back to see whether members of their family are following them or not. So, and they can go on calling for quite a long period of time. And then if the others don't come, they can go into what I call cadence rumbling, where there's this back and forth conversation that I've recorded up to like half an hour. And sometimes they will agree on something, and it seems to be some sort of negotiation, and then sometimes they'll go their separate ways. They'll just finally give up trying to agree on something. But I do think that it's quite likely that they can refer to whether it's a direction or whether it's an actual place name. But I think that would be very fruitful. The other thing that working in Gorongosa, where we worked from 2011 to 2019. Very aggressive elephants, and we were often charged, but this was often group charges, where the animals had, each family had different traditions in the way they would try to attack us, and I just found that the complexity of the communication that was going on was just, it was just amazing. I don't know how you would study it, or even record it, but it seemed to me that there were very clear instructions being given, and that families knew exactly, or the individuals of their family knew exactly where they were supposed to be and how they were supposed to respond to us.
Amazing, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Katie. It's Diana Reese. Great to see you again. And I had Joyce. What did I just say? I'm sorry. And Michael, I just had a question for you, both of you, actually. So, have you looked at the calls of younger animals as well? I don't know if you included this in your database, and whether the mother's calls, if it's a mother or it's another animal, do their calls change at all over time? I don't know if you've taken a look at that at all. Just wondering about that.
They do change over time. In fact, their calls, the calls that mothers give to calves and the calf responses, I think develop over time into little greeting rumbles. So Mickey mentioned that, you mentioned allo mothers, Mickey, or individuals who you thought might have been allo mothers to the receiver or something when they were younger. Right. And I think that these very close relationships between allo mothers and the calves, when they're adults, are likely to be the ones that have these close little greeting rumble calls between one another.
Thank you.
I remember correctly from my few readings on elephants, the couple of readings I've read done on elephants, I understand that they communicate or they use their highly olfactory animals, and so smell and vibration is also something that they use. Is there a way to add some of that data, at least vibration, to the sounds that you're picking up to try to complement the data that you're using to identify the names and how they call each other out?
So the vibratory stuff has mostly been studied by Caitlin O'Connell Rodwell in Namibia, but there's also some people who are starting to do some work on vibratory communication at my field site in Samburu. So in order to record that, you need to put like you need to bury a special device in the ground in order to record those rumbles. So it's definitely possible to record them, but the disadvantage is that you need to predict where the elephants are going to be, because you can't just move it around very easily. So at Caitlin's field site, she has like this observation tower at a watering hole. So she knows the elephants are going to come there eventually. She can just set up the vibration recorder ahead of time. It's Samburu, I think it's probably more challenging because you have to, I mean, they have done some work there with the vibratory communication, but you have to kind of predict where the elephants are going to be, and then know that they're going to call and put bury the thing in the ground. So yeah, you can definitely do it, but in terms of getting like a large volume of recordings, it does make it a little bit more logistically challenging. And with olfactory communication, I think this is actually something I was wondering if I know nothing about robotics, but like a lot of their olfactory communication is through temporal gland secretions on the side of their head, which obviously you can't collect from a wild elephant unless you've immobilized them. But I don't know, just like total speculation. I wonder if it's possible to build some kind of minuscule drone that would mimic a fly and just land on their head and suck up some temperin solution. But
segue to our next question.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm a roboticist that makes little flies. No, but I before you said that though, I was just curious if you could speculate, either of you or both of you could speculate on data collection needs. You kind of were alluding to this when you're talking about Caitlin O'Connell's work with geophones, but I'm just curious, you know, if you had your pie in the sky wish list, what would you have for data collection devices?
Oh, I have so many things, but Joyce, do you want to start?
I just hate the idea that we have to immobilize elephants. It's so traumatic for the family, and you know, sometimes elephants have been lost, and sometimes collars have gone on and not been taken off, and elephants continue to grow. So anyway, it would be absolutely fantastic to be able to maybe for shorter periods of time, but to have a family, let's say, that we're following really closely, and be able to put recording devices on each individual, but you know, not via a collar, but a very small robotic device.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think anything that could record from the elephants in a non-invasive way continuously would be hugely helpful, but also like maybe slightly less pie in the sky idea, having an acoustic camera that is portable enough to carry around in a Jeep and could pinpoint the location of sound, because just identifying the caller for elephants is challenging, and we miss a lot of calls that way because we just can't figure out who made them. So having an acoustic camera that's recording continuous video and audio and can pinpoint in the video which elephant is making the sound, that would be hugely helpful as well.
I had one with some Japanese filmmakers came years ago. They had a camera that was used for detecting where low frequency sound was coming from in a city, and they followed. Actually, it was all this cadence calling, and there was a discussion going on between Enid and Echo about where they were going to go, and there was this calling back and forth, and you could see which, you know, very clearly which elephant was called.
Oh wow, that's incredible.
Yeah,
I didn't know the commercial things would work that well. But
Hi. So do you have for both of you, do you have a kind of
where would you place the range of like complexity of what their discourse might be about? Most between like what is the most complex you think it might be and what is the least complex, now that you know that they have naming?
Joyce, do you want to talk about that?
I can narrow it down a bit if that helps. But
I don't know. They're complex animals living in, very in a very complex social system, and which they navigate so well. I mean, I've always thought that it's much more, what they're saying to one another is much more, sorry, I keep using the word complex, but complex than we imagine. Some of the things, like for instance, there's so much of their rather complex behavior that where they're really vocalizing a lot that we can't make head or tail of, because they all talk on top of one another. And during a greeting ceremony, you could have 30 elephants all vocalizing together and all producing structurally different looking rumbles and trumpets and roars and everything at the same time. So is it just a lot of exuberance like we have when we greet one another, or is there something more going on? Not just it's great to be together again, but and what are we going to do now, and what's been your experiences since we've been apart? Because some of these greetings can go on for 5 minutes of rumbling.
Great. Well, thank you both for such a fascinating talk. And I know here at Project SETI, we're maniacally focused on whales, but we're really interested in transcending our work in service of the whales and in service of animals like elephants. So we're excited to explore synergies on where there could be crossover in studying these magnificent animals. So thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you.